Good afternoon. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Boris Aldridge. I'm a practicing ceramicist and educator with a special interest in architectural lusterware tiles. I've been making and designing tiles for over 15 years for my workshop in the United Kingdom. I started off making commercial decorative tiles for kitchens and bathrooms, but about 5 years ago, I went to the Alhambra Palace in Spain, and I was absolutely bowled over by the incredible tile work and intricacy of the designs. I vowed that when I came back from Spain, I would research this and develop my own practice with a focus on the tile, not just as a decorative object, but also as a work of art. Since then, I've undertaken commissions from as small as a single tile to large-scale architectural installations like this fountain that you see, which I made and assembled myself in my workshop. I also make other architectural features, such as this makana that you see. I sculpt the tiles out of clay and file them in my kiln. And I also do ceramic screens and a bit of geometry you can see in the background as well. And some large-scale panels that you see there. My practice is very much informed by both the Islamic and African traditions, as well as English culture and design. About 2 years ago, I first discovered lusterware, and immediately fell in love with its precious and mysterious properties. For those that don't know about lusterware, it's the process where you apply a pigment onto a tile, a metallic pigment, and you get this lovely metallic sheen. Originally, it was done with copper luster, but now you can use gold and platinum, and it gives the ceramic surface a unique quality. Once I started researching the history of lusterware, I discovered, to my surprise, it went back hundreds of years, thousands of years. And on researching the subject, I discovered that in the 12th and 13th century in Iran, in Kashan, it reached its peak. And the tiles from that period are considered by many to be the golden age of lusterware pottery. So here's an example of an architectural frieze tile from Kashan. And there's one in an 8-pointed star. After seeing these beautiful tiles in museums in London, I began reading books about the subject, and I wanted to include the kind of essence of Kashan lusterware into my own practice. So I started developing my own technique, fusing Kashan motifs with ceramic techniques that I've been developing myself. And it was shortly after this that I got invited to the Prince's School to take a workshop on Kashan lusterware. And I got invited to deliver a lecture here, which I was very honoured. Receiving the invitation to deliver this lecture gave me not only the opportunity to reflect on the history and techniques behind Kashan lusterware tiles, but also how it has influenced and informed my own practice as a ceramicist and craftsman. For as I swiftly discovered, the process of incorporating elements from a strong artistic tradition or cultural movement from the past is fraught with difficulties and questions. How can I learn from the past? How can I approach a particular artistic tradition? In my own case, it was Kashan lusterware tiles. But this can apply to any other artistic tradition or cultural movement. So how can I approach it? How can I draw on its elements and essence without letting my work turn into cliches weak pastiches, or perhaps the most ruinous of all phenomenon, cultural appropriation? How can we, as artists and craftsmen, use the methods and practices from the past, but also create truly innovative, beautiful work? For it is the duty of an artist and craftsman, in my humble opinion, not just to copy, but also to add to the rich tapestry of art. To answer some of these questions, I'll be telling my own personal story as a ceramicist and educator. I'll be deconstructing my relationship with Kashan tiles, and revealing some of the principles that I use to guide me on my artistic journey, so that you too can apply them to your practice, whether as an artist, designer, academic, or indeed any sort of creative person with a passion for the past and culture. So, what are these 4 principles, I hear you ask? Well, for me, they're the following: analysis, application, innovation, and collaboration. They're the 4 principles that guided me, and I will be examining and deconstructing each of these elements in turn. So the first of these the principles is analysis. The celebrated American historian Kenneth Stamp once said, "With the historian, it's an article of faith that knowledge of the past is a key to understanding the present." This strikes me as being a universal truth, and one that applies equally to artists, craftsmen, and designers. The ability to successfully analyze an artistic tradition is the building block, without which any effort to understand or incorporate its essence will be doomed to fail. Without real understanding of tradition, an artist can only hope to copy and produce cliches. Analysis is without doubt one of the most important mechanisms that you can utilize to understand your subject, and I cannot emphasize this highly enough. So there are three main questions one should ask when analysing an artistic tradition: when, why, and how. When did it happen? Why did it happen? And how did it happen? In the case of the Golden Age Kashan Lusterware, we have approximate dates when the majority of the best-known pieces were made. This was at the end of the 12th century and throughout the 13th century. This period marked the culmination of the knowledge and the artistic inspiration. So we have the dates. This leads us on to the next, more complex question: why? Why does an artistic tradition peak at a specific time, a specific point in time, and in a specific geographical location? This is vital for understanding, as it enables us to place the art in an historical and artistic context. Not only does it deepen our knowledge about the history, but it also allows us to find meaning in the work. In the case of Kashan Lusterware tiles, I found myself asking the question, why did it happen in the 12th and the 13th century? Why specifically in Kashan, a town in the north of Iran? In order to answer this question, we have to go back 2 centuries, to Iraq in the 9th century. For it was there, under the Abbasids, that lusterware was first invented. The technique of lusterware onto ceramics was first invented by Islamic potters in the court of Al-Rashid. From there, lusterware production moved to Egypt. And we see lusterware pottery being produced in quantity in Fustat under the Fatimid Caliphate between the 10th and the 12th century. Following the collapse of the Fatimid dynasty, the technique of lusterware spread to Kashan under the Seljuk Empire, and we get the first great flowering of lusterware pottery from approximately 1170 to 1220. Production was then interrupted for about 50 years by the Mongolian invasion, but resumed again under the Ilkhanid dynasty. And this is where we see the second and final era of great Kashan lusterware being produced, from the end of the 13th until the beginning of the 14th century. After about 1340, lusterware production effectively ceased in Kashan, and the kilns fell silent. Why? We do not know. Did it fall out of fashion as a form of architectural decoration? We do not know. But for whatever the reason, the great era of Kashan Lusterware is over. So that's a little bit of historical context behind Lusterware, the Kashan Lusterware. But that still doesn't explain why it was made in Kashan in particular and not in any other town or city. And for that, we need to answer the third and final question on the list: how was it made? The techniques behind the production of Kashan Lusterware are complex and difficult. As I've discovered with my own practice as a ceramicist, developing a process with consistency and with artistic merit takes not only skill, but also a rare combination of technical expertise and artistic vision. Let us now imagine that we are a potter working in Kashan in the late 13th century. What is the first thing we want to do? Is the first thing that we need? We want to make a tile. Clay. Clay varies in quality and constituents. The clay in the Kashan Lusterware tiles is not actually a clay, it's called stone paste. And it's made up of a mixture of approximately 10% clay, 80% quartz, and 10% alkaline frit. The potter Abu al-Qasim describes the painstaking process of making this stone paste in his famous treatise on ceramics. The ingredients were sieved and mixed with water before being thoroughly kneaded. The resulting paste was then left overnight to mature. This was an incredibly time-consuming process compared to using normal clay. For the larger architectural scale pieces, they may have used ground up pieces of fire pottery or grog to reduce the risks of cracking and structural failure. So, we have our stone paste. We then mold it to the form of the piece we want to create. In the case of Kashan Lusterware, a lot of them were done in this format with the 8-pointed star. But the process of making Lusterware tiles is not just with one firing in the kiln. It's fired twice. The first firing is done to get the white glaze that you see in the background. This was done using an alkaline glaze, sometimes with an addition of lead tin oxide, which whitened them whilst retaining a fusible surface for the luster. The approximate composition of these glazes was 80% quartz, 10% plastic clay, and 10% alkaline frit. Once the glaze was applied to the surface of the tile, it was then ready for firing. To temperatures we could approximate of about 1,000 degrees Celsius. It was fired in a wood-fired kiln, and it would have been carefully monitored during the firing process so that they got to temperature at the right speed. If the temperature went up too fast, the pieces were at risk of exploding, as any moisture that's trapped within the clay turns to steam. The larger, thicker architectural tiles would have been especially vulnerable to trap moisture, and the firing schedule would be certain to reflect that. The Kashan potter Abu al-Qasim talks of firing schedules lasting up to 1 week. I mean, to put that into context, the longest firing I've ever done has been about 24 hours, and these were kiln firings that lasted up to 1 week, which was an incredible technical achievement. And it also gives an idea of the level of control the potters had over the kiln at that time. Once the kiln has cooled, we take our piece out, which will then be entirely white and shiny. So you have a plain white surface, shiny surface, and it's ready to decorate. For this, Kashan potters used a copper pigment luster made from copper and silver compounds mixed with ochre or clay. In a famous 14th century treatise on lusterware ceramics, Abul Qasim describes the recipe that makes pigment lusterware. Reading it reveals an incredibly complex, expensive, and technically demanding and lengthy process involving not just copper and silver compounds, but other surprising ingredients like arsenic and vinegar. So we have our pigment, we're ready to decorate. But how? How are we going to decorate the tile? Professor Oliver Watson identifies 3 different phases in the drawing style of Kashan Lusterware. The monumental, inspired by Egyptian types, the miniature style, based upon patterns and figures of book illumination, and finally the Kashan tile, which is what we see here, which mark the kind of pinnacle of the style. The subject matters were based on nature. Most of the lusterware featured biomorphic imagery of some sort. As you can see here, palmettes were frequently used, as well as the kind of graceful intertwining stems of the flowers. The Kashan potters frequently portrayed animals, as well as mythological creatures such as dragons and harpies. You can see this rather beautiful cross with different animals, rabbits and what seems to be jackals, or you have this ambiguity with some of the animals. You can't quite tell what they're supposed to be, but this adds to the kind of mystique of the designs. And there's another Kashan tile with the cobalt blue around there, surrounding it. Figures were often given prominence, importance. A lot of regal images, the ruler on his throne, or the nobleman on his horse, hunting or hawking. The head of the figure was usually given prominence by the positioning of a halo behind it. You can see the white halo behind the head of the figure there, of the figures. These were not intended to signify the figure's divinity, but rather his distinction. The figures were not based on actual real-life rulers or noblemen, but rather to suggest the idea of kingship and nobility. Was there an underlying spirituality behind these apparent secular scenes? It is possible, according to Professor Oliver Watson, that there is a link between the imagery on the tiles and Sufism. Much of the imagery that the tiles contain can be open to Sufi allegorical interpretation. And we know that during this era, Sufis were adopting many of the Shiite beliefs. The potters that made Kashan Lusterware are assumed to be Shiite for reasons I will explain later on in this lecture. So once we've realized the main composition, whether it be a figure, an animal, or geometric biomorphic pattern, as the main image, we're then left to concentrate on the remaining 2 parts, the background and the surround. For the background, they used curlicues, and these little squiggles and dots were used to fill up the space. Most of the Kashan tiles, they didn't leave any space untouched. Every space was filled. If there's any blank space, you'd fill it by inscribing through the pigment with a scribe and creating these wonderful dots and loops. They're white in color, and they're created using, like I said, using a scribe to cut through the pigment. Many of the tiles have writing in the form of poetry, blessings, or Quranic texts from specific surahs to frame the composition. You can see there, especially with the eight-pointed stars. Most of them had text around the outside. On star tiles, the first and the 112th surah were often joined together. The secular texts were generally made up of poetry in the form of quatrains and extracts from epic texts. These texts are not considered high literary achievements and often bear no relationship with the image that accompany them. This may seem puzzling at first, but may be simply due to the fact that potters were potters and not poets. They recognised the fact that the tiles needed text around the border to complete the piece, and they reached for any verses or poetry that were to hand or in their memory. So we've sketched out our design, we've added the background, and now we're ready to fire the tile for a second time. The second luster firing is a more complicated procedure than for the first firing. It involves a process called reduction. What is reduction? Well, this is the process during the firing where the kiln is starved of oxygen, usually by closing off any vents and letting the kiln fill with smoke. This produces carbon monoxide, which is hungry to extract oxygen from any source. In this case, it's the silver and copper compounds in the luster pigment, which give up their oxygen and are then deposited as a thin metallic film on the surface of the glaze. As with every component of the lusterware process, the second firing has to be very precisely controlled. The temperature of the kiln to which it was fired had to be correct within approximately 20 degrees. Once this temperature is achieved, the reduction process could begin. This was not an easy task. Too little reduction and the pieces would be yellow and pale. Too much reduction and the pieces turned dull and dark. So to solve this, test pieces were often placed in the kiln and would have been taken out at regular intervals to provide an indication as to the progress of the reduction. Once the potter was satisfied that the point of successful reduction had been reached, then oxygen was allowed back into the kiln and it was left to cool. After it cooled, the piece was then taken out and rubbed down to give a beautiful golden metallic sheen. I brought in one of my own pieces. I don't know if we can have the camera on there, if you can see. And this is inspired by the Kashan Lusterware tiles. And you get this rather, can everybody see this? And you get this lovely metallic sheen. You just take the right way out, there we go. You can see how it glints and glimmers in the light. I also have one in a stronger colour. Yeah, you can see that. You can see the gold luster on the surface of the tile there. And finally, this is a square piece. It's not a traditional Kashan shape. It shows you again. It's very much inspired by the imagery. So, we've taken our tile to the kiln, we've examined it, it looks great. Now it's ready to be finished and to be installed. But where? What kind of buildings were these tiles used for? According to Professor Oliver Watson, out of the 21 securely recorded religious buildings that contained tiles, 18 are tombs, 2 are mosques, and 1 is a shrine. This indicates a clear funerary link between the buildings and the tiles. In fact, this is a cenotaph. So yes, there is a funerary link between the tiles. We don't quite know why, but they appear to be mostly used in shrines and tombs. Almost all of the buildings that they're found in belong to the minority Shiite sect at the time, and it is therefore likely that the potters were Shiite themselves. So, we've analysed the Kashan Lusterware tiles. We've marvelled at the inventiveness and skill and techniques of the ancient Persian potters. What's next? What lessons can we, as artists, living in this modern world, in the era of the internet, the celebrity, the cult of the individual, what lessons can we possibly draw from a group of artisans that lived and worked nearly 1,000 years ago in the small city of Kashan? What, if any, possible principles that these potters lived and worked by can I use to further my own practice for a craftsman? This is the question that I've often asked myself. And just as we have put Kashan Lusterware in an historical context to properly understand it, so we need to examine the society and history surrounding the contemporary potter and craftsman in order to understand the challenges that he or she faces. So what hope is there ever of creating beautiful, long-lasting work when we treat our contemporary artists and craftsmen like this? These are clearly and self-evidently not the conditions we need to create beautiful art or craft. It's not as if society doesn't value beautiful art. A single original Kashan or Iznik tile fetches hundreds of thousands of dollars when they come up for auction. Much more than any contemporary tile could ever hope to sell for. Clearly, society appreciates and values the beauty of such works, and yet it continues to fail to understand how and in what conditions this work was created. It is not the individual that creates great ceramics and great ceramic tiles, but rather society itself. Only by society creating the right conditions for the artists and craftsmen to work in can we hope to rediscover the art of making beautiful tiles and beautiful work. Certainly in Western Europe, where I'm from. So what can the individual artist do about this? Surely he or she is powerless in the face of such wonderful objects. The short answer is no. We have the ability to change society, and it is our responsibility as artists to bring about this change. How? How can we do this? Well, in my case, and I think in all artists' case, it's developing our own practice by learning from tradition, by incorporating these traditions and applying it in our own work. And this brings me neatly onto the next topic of my lecture, application. How can we apply the lessons of the past into our own practice as artists? Well, first of all, we need to be working regularly. I've been making tiles now every day of my life for over 15 years. I must have made over 100,000 tiles. Not just intricate works of art, as I've shown here, but also very simple, plain, square tiles for kitchens and bathrooms. It's become part of the rhythm of my life, just as making lusterware tiles was to the Kashan potters. By making work, by consistently handling the clay, working with the glazes, working with the kiln, you become attuned to the process. You become attuned to the process. This is very important. You need to be working every day. Do not fall into the trap of waiting until inspiration hits you before you start making. For me, this really works. Inspiration comes to me once I've started making a tile, not before. It often leads to a different direction to when I started. That's to be expected and part of the natural creative process. And another thing is, do not be driven by an urge to make money from your work. No one ever became rich by making beautiful pottery. Unfortunately, your focus must be 100% on the work itself, rather than what happens after you've made it is really out of your control, at least in my opinion. What I can control is the creative process, how I make the tiles, how I glaze them, what designs I want to put on them, how I want to decorate them. That's within my control. Once they're finished, for me, that's something else. But working every day doesn't necessarily mean mindlessly plugging away. Every time I make a tile, be it a simple or complex one, I'm constantly thinking about its appearance, whether or not I can improve it, what works, what doesn't work. And this leads me on to my next topic, innovation. The great Kashan potters were innovators as artists. They weren't reinventing the wheel. Lusterware pottery had been invented 200 years previously. What they did was incremental changes. They improved it slightly and slightly and built on existing technological methods to push the limits of what was possible. They perfected the technique of lusterware, managing to achieve incredible variation of color from a dark red to a gold sheen. The other thing that's very impressive is the scale of the individual tiles. They're still some of the biggest tiles, certainly the handmade tiles I've ever seen in museums. When I've seen Kashan tiles, the scale is enormous. And I can testify as a potter myself that making tiles on that scale, some of them are that kind of height, that kind of width and thick, and it's very difficult. With tiles, the bigger you go, the more difficult it is to fire them. You have to make sure they're structurally sound. They take a lot longer to decorate, and as with any ceramics, you get wastage. So with the tiles that I make, I can take up to 5 days to decorate them. I mean, a tile like this, I imagine, would take over a week, at least, for each tile, I should imagine. They take a very long time. And there's nothing more heartbreaking than spending a week on a tile, putting it in the kiln, and opening the kiln, and it's broken. But that happens, unfortunately. That's the nature of tiles. So, pushing the boundaries. Oops. That's very important as an artist, to push the boundaries, not to be happy with what's gone on before, but to experiment and try new things. With every tile that I make, I try to make it different. Try to make it different to the one I did before. So, how can we learn and innovate in today's world? On the surface, it might seem easier than ever to innovate now than before. After all, every day we are bombarded with seductive promises of the potential of new technology and innovation, especially through the power of computing. And indeed, this is true on one level. I myself use the computer to design this fountain here, which was incredibly useful as a way of saving time for me. So the computer has its place. However, I do believe that technology should only be used as a tool of an artist in the design process, but never a substitute for the maker's hand. For all the promises that technology makes, especially with science and communication, it is ultimately insufficient as a way of expressing art. It's too perfect, in my opinion, and does not allow for the human expression, the little mistakes that you make when you're making the tiles, the little variations in glaze thickness when you're painting them. When they're fired, you get sometimes the glaze, a little bit of the glaze will flake off, and you get these lovely imperfections, which you can only get if you make it by hand. There's no other way. So I will now finish the lecture by talking about a technique that I've developed and been working on for the last 2 years, called vitreous lusterware. And I will just take you briefly through the process of making that. And that's the technique that I use to make these tiles, this tile that you see here. And you can see a photo of it here as well. This is a little panel of wall tiles I'm working on. This is just a little segment of it. The actual finished panel will be a lot bigger. Will be made up of maybe 80 stars. This is in the traditional Kashan style of the 8-pointed star and the cross in between the 8-pointed stars. In the middle of the stars, in the middle of the crosses, you see the turquoise color. What I've done there is cut a well in the center of the tile and filled it with crushed glass. and this gives it a lovely depth of colour and surface. So in some places of these tiles, there's glass up to about a centimetre thick. And what it does is reflects the light. When the light comes in, it reflects and it sparkles, and it complements the gold luster perfectly. I use gold luster with these tiles. It hadn't been invented in the 13th century. It's a relatively recent invention. So it's something I want to experiment with in my own practice. So how do I make the tiles? Start off with a lump of clay. A simple piece of clay. I then put the template over the top. This is made with frosted polypropylene, which peels off the surface of the clay easily, but you can equally use wood, as that doesn't stick on the surface. And then I cut around it using a craft knife. So it's rolled, the clay is rolled out to give a uniform thickness first, and then put the template on and cut round the shape. In this case, it's an 8-pointed star. This is still with a wet clay at the moment, so this is after I've cut round it. You can see the shape, you can see the tile now beginning to take shape. I then cut the hole, a well in the centre of the tile, which is then filled with crushed glass. So a lot of glass goes into that. What happens is it melts. I fire it to temperatures of 1,235 degrees. And then, depending on what colour I want the base tile, it can be turquoise, it can be green, it can just be white. And then the glaze melts, and you get this lovely reflective quality that comes out of the tile afterwards. It's then ready to, and that's the tile before it's been decorated. So after the first firing, this is one that came out of the kiln, my kiln, about a month ago. And you can see where the glaze has because there's so much glass, and you can see the dark blue, which is cobalt. And where the glass runs, it mixes with the cobalt and moves it around. So it's rather mysterious, kind of almost like a cloud pattern, and swirling patterns that go on. And this is all unplanned. So this is part of the magic of working with ceramics. How they go into the kiln and how they come out of the kiln is very different. For me, I never know how it's going to look. It's always a surprise. Opening the kiln, I never know how the tile is going to look. This one is, I haven't decorated this one yet, but I will be decorating it once I get back to the UK. After it's come out, I then decorate the tile using a mixture of resists and brushwork. So this one's actually a kind of cream-coloured tile, and I'm just halfway through making it. So I'll paint the tile with white matte house paint, and then cut through the surface to expose the glaze underneath. Once I've exposed the glaze underneath, I'll then cover the whole, in the places which need to be decorated, I'll then cover the whole tile with the luster, and it will only stick to the places where the glazes are exposed. So that's the basic method. And then after that, the tile is then fired again to a temperature of about 700 degrees. That's a finished example. Another one of the tiles that makes up the wall. This is a deer. Again, I'm relating it to the original Kashan style with the kind of board around the outside, and the kind of Kashan style foliage around the back of the deer. You can see the blue and the gold really are very strong together. And there you can see another view with some of the green tiles. Again, these are all made using the same process. These tiles are very big, incidentally. Each tile is probably, each star tile is about 55 centimetres by 55 centimetres. So I work on a very big scale. Each tile takes about 6 days to make. So, and each one is unique. Each tile I could decorate uniquely. This is a very common, the pattern that you see here in this cross is a very common Kashan Lusterware motif, and it has a poetry around the outside which I wrote, but this is very, with the palmettes, the row of palmettes, it's very common. And I'm also working with musicians. This is a project involving musicians, and I'm basing some of the tiles on local singer-songwriters and their songs. Which brings me on to the final segment of the lecture, collaboration. This is vitally important as an artist. I'm a big believer in working together and sharing knowledge. I view my role as an artist not just to plough a lonely furrow whilst ignoring my fellow practitioners, but to work together and pool resources. So for me, it's very important to reach out, connect with other people interested in that, share the knowledge, and build up a community of people interested in the same things that I'm interested in. I also teach Lusterware. I've just finished taking a 5-day Kashan Lusterware course in London at the Prince's School for Traditional Arts. So that's for me very important. Passing on the knowledge that you accumulate is very important. Whenever an opportunity arises for me, I always ask myself the following question: what can I give? Not what can I take? For me, the job of an artist craftsman is not just to make work, but also engender a change in society that for too long has neglected its artists and craftsmen. For in the end, it is not down to the individual artist to create beautiful work, but the responsibility of society as a whole.